Good evening, everyone. I'm Deborah Lockwood, Chair of the Washington County Planning Commission. Today is August 21st, 2024, and this evening's meeting of the Planning Commission is called to order. Clerk Aguilar, may we have the roll call, please?
Commissioner Fry.
Present.
Commissioner Kaiser.
Here.
Commissioner Monte Blanco. Here. Commissioner Rosenberry.
Present.
Commissioner Whips.
Present.
Commissioner Will.
Present.
Vice Chair Maury Bidu.
Present.
Chair Lockwood.
Present.
We have 8 planning commissioners present. We have a quorum.
Thank you. Next item is the director's report, and I believe Ms. Cherniak is going to do that for us tonight.
Thank you, and good evening, Chair Lockwood and Commissioners. Erin Wardell is out sick this evening, so I'll be sitting in for her this evening, and we'll give the director's report. We were very pleased to see so many planning commissioners in person this evening. I just have a few updates before we go into the hearing. The county's Transit Development Plan online open house is currently up and running and will continue through September 6th. That's a project that will help identify improvements to public transportation in rural Washington County and other areas that aren't well served by bus routes. So if that's something of interest to you, we do encourage you to visit the project webpage for more information. And you would get to that through the LUT webpage, and you can look there for the Transit Development Plan online open house. Today's Planning Commission meeting will be dedicated to hearing number 2 on Ordinance numbers 901 and 902. Those are the significant natural resource ordinances. One looking at plan policy and community plans, and the other on code revisions. As far as upcoming Planning Commission meetings, September 4th, which is a day meeting, would be hearing 3 if it's needed for this ordinance or these 2 ordinances, 901 and 902. So that would be the date that we would ask you to continue to if you do choose to continue the ordinance tonight. At this time, we don't have any items scheduled for the September 18th meeting, and we would recommend that that be canceled. And we'll also be working on a schedule of work sessions for future meetings, and we'll be able to talk about that further in September as well. And with that, I will conclude.
Thank you. Do commissioners have any questions at this point for Ms. Cherniak? Not seeing any, so thank you. We can move on to public communication. Clerk Aguilar, do we have anyone signed up?
No, no one has signed up in advance for public communications. Would anyone in the audience or in the virtual audience like to communicate to the Planning Commission on a non-agenda item? And if so, please indicate by raising your hand or virtual hand. Seeing none? Oh.
Thank you for the question. Ms. Cherniak, do you want to comment?
Well, I'm just wanting to be on the record. You would need to come up and state your name and address, and then put that question in the record. I'm not sure if that is a question for the Planning Commission versus the Board of Commissioners. Yeah. So.
Shirley Evers.
So go ahead and have a seat and just state your name and address for the record, and just speak into the microphone, and we'll get your question on the record.
Shirley Evers, and I'm from Forest Grove area, and I'm just wondering if I could get information on, I could be at the wrong committee, finding out about the fairground information when they had the rodeo and the outcome of what they had.
And Ms. Evers, if you give the clerk your contact information, we can connect you with the right people.
Thank you.
Is there anyone online?
Seeing no one, we can proceed.
Thank you. Our next item is a public hearing on ordinances numbers 901 and 902, and we'll start with a staff report.
Good evening, Chair Lockwood and Commissioners. My name is Michelle Miller, Senior Planner with Land Use and Transportation. I have with me Teresa Cherniak, Principal Planner in Community Planning, and online I have our lead consultant, Kathy Corliss with MIG. So tonight we're here for the second hearing on ordinance numbers 901 and 902, amendments to the county's Goal 5 program for significant natural resources. So tonight's presentation on the ordinances will include a recap of our July meeting and ordinance process, a discussion about the testimony we've received on the ordinance, and staff recommendations to the Planning Commission. Since we sent out the staff report a week ago, we've continued to receive testimony that we've forwarded to the Planning Commission up until early this afternoon. To recap where we are in the process, we had our first hearing on ordinances numbers 901 and 902 on July 24th with a companion staff report and presentation that provided the background and analysis of the ordinances. At the hearing, the Planning Commission received testimony and took comments and questions. Tonight's presentation will go over those issues and testimony that we've been receiving and up to this date and to facilitate your further discussion. So throughout this process, the Planning Commission can recommend changes to the text and maps to the Board of Commissioners. When the changes to the ordinances are proposed and recommended, it's called an engrossment. The Board has the ability to engross the ordinance, but the Planning Commission can make that recommendation. Any ordinance changes can be discussed by the Planning Commission through the hearing and deliberations process, and you could decide to make a recommendation for changes by a motion and a vote. Now turning to some of the comments that we've received, we're going to talk about our mapping issues. Since we filed the ordinance, we've received a handful of requests to make some map changes to our inventory and our community plan maps. Our consultant is checking those with the established criteria we set out in the inventory, and we're going to be considering any requests for changes through August 31st, and that'll give us enough time to prepare and evaluate those for the upcoming board hearings. Any changes that are determined to meet the inventory criteria will be proposed through an engrossment process. So we've received some additional comments about the inventory in general, and I want to review the process we used. Our primary task was to consolidate the county's significant natural resource inventory categories with Metro's mapping for riparian wildlife habitat 1 and 2 and upland wildlife habitat class A and B. We did not add any new areas beyond which had already been identified in those inventories. Other habitat inventories were considered to help determine whether the resource was significant, using some of the sources that have been identified in the testimony that you've been receiving. The annex lands were removed, and we also removed developed areas and areas where the habitat boundary had been clearly delineated through the development review process. To show you how that process worked for the maps, I'm using another example in the process for the Aloha area. This map shows the area around TV Highway between Hillsborough and Beaverton. Here's the county's existing mapping, that original Goal 5 inventory that we did in the 1980s, with the water resources shown in blue, and the green are the mapped wildlife habitat areas, mostly surrounding the water resources, excuse me. So here's that same area with the metro layers of habitat overlaid with the county's layers, showing the same colors for the county's areas and adding the metro habitat areas, the riparian shown in kind of a grayer blue, and the greens and the orange and yellow are the various different habitat layers. We showed in green and bright green if the areas have also overlapped with a county, original county mapped layer. And here's the outcome of the analysis for the inventory, consolidating those and removing the different habitat areas through the inventory process. And we primarily replaced the county's water areas with the metro riparian areas and removed some upland areas that were developed or met other requirements through removal. Oh, so that large large yellow area is Jenkins Estates, property owned by Tualatin Hills Park and Rec Department. So it's kind of a large area in there that was identified on the metro mapping. So in some urban unincorporated areas where more recent Goal 5 inventory work had been completed by a county or a city, our updated draft inventory incorporates the updated inventory work that was done by those jurisdictions. For the Cooper Mountain area, which is a huge urban growth boundary expansion area added to the urban growth boundary. Oh, you can't hear me? Okay. Use which one?
Use this one, good.
Use this one? Okay.
But you can speak more directly into it. There you go.
Oh, okay. All right. So you've missed so much of a good part already. I hear now it is a lot better. Okay. In some urban unincorporated areas where more recent Goal 5 inventory work had been completed by the county or a city, the draft updated inventory incorporates that work that was done by those jurisdictions. For the Cooper Mountain area, an urban growth boundary expansion area that was added to the urban growth boundary in 2018 by Metro, the timing is a little bit more complex. The city of Beaverton is still finalizing and adopting its natural resource inventory update, and the habitat boundaries that were mapped by Metro in 2007 are being updated. We're using Beaverton's data from Cooper Mountain's local wetland inventory to inform the wildlife habitat layer mapping, since that LWI has been reviewed by the Department of State Lands. We can incorporate any further changes made through Beaverton's inventory process in the late 2005 Omnibus Map Correction Ordinance that we are proposing to do, to meet any changes that they might have further along in the process once it's been adopted. Now more about potential impacts on individual developed lots. So we heard throughout the process about concerns community members had about how the regulations would affect them as they were maintaining their property and their ability to remove hazardous, diseased, or dying trees, especially in light of the recent winter storm. In light of those issues, the regulations outline that hazardous, diseased, and dying trees will be exempt, along with other exemptions for small lots and lots that have a minimum amount of mapped upland wildlife habitat. Those exemptions are found in Section 422-4. Ordinance number 902 also requires a simple Type 1 tree removal permit for trees. Those are within a disturbance area of 5,000 square feet and located within 10 feet of an existing habitable building, or located, excuse me. This is a visual depiction of a disturbance area that is outlined in Section 422-7.1a. Here's an example of an existing house showing the 3,000 square foot disturbance area, where any of the trees within that area could be removed through a Type 1 process. This graphic shows that the applicant adds a new accessory dwelling unit and uses the additional 2,000 square feet of disturbance area to follow that process follow the Type 1 allowance of the disturbance area. At the July 24th hearing, it included a discussion of the 5,000 square foot disturbance area and whether it should be expanded on maybe larger sites that we have in our inventory. Staff doesn't recommend enlarging the disturbance area. The exemption was intended to allow tree removal within a reasonable area for a house and related outdoor area. Staff believes this 5,000 square feet is a reasonable area, and this disturbance area does not scale up based on a size of a lot. Any further tree removal, an applicant could follow our Type 2 process. The Type 1 tree permit allows for a disturbance area around an existing habitable building. We received a comment from the City of Wilsonville that requested clarification on what exactly habitable meant. And so we are suggesting adding some language for the purpose of this section. A habitable building is one that is connected to water, sewer, and power and has a permanent heat source. So that would indicate the extent of habitability and provide clarity for what type of structures we're intending for this Type 1 permit process. So one Planning Commission member questioned how this new process will work for a homeowner or developer and what the anticipated cost for homeowners with significant natural resources would be. The presence of a significant natural resource on a property will not impact that property unless the owner wishes to develop. The definition of development includes tree removal. For riparian wildlife habitat, allowed development within the verified boundary is strictly limited, and that's based on existing clean water services requirements. For upland wildlife habitat, or the riparian habitat that falls outside that verified riparian boundary, future development within the area is subject to the proposed regulations in our ordinance. When a property owner comes to the Land Use and Transportation Department, staff checks to see first whether the property contains a mapped significant habitat. For riparian wildlife habitat, the owner checks in with Clean Water Services and to delineate the area and submits a Clean Water Service provider letter to the county. For the upland wildlife habitat, the proposed development will be required to meet the standards of our section Community Development Code section 422, 9, 10, or 11, unless it's one of those Type 1 process process requirement, meets type 1 permit requirements. So these requirements will vary depending on whether the property owner is within a pre-2006 or a post-2005 urban growth boundary expansion area. And current planning staff will identify the area, which area is applicable based on our community plan mapping. And you saw those dots that would indicate a post-2005 areas on the community plan maps. That kind of overlay indicates those areas. So property owners raised concerns about the limits on future development potential and possible changes to the property value resulting from the proposed updates to our maps and regulations. In response, we looked at changes to the land use we say that changes to the land use regulations have potential to impact property value, so the county is required to notify potentially affected property owners through our Measure 56 notice that we sent out. It doesn't mean that the changes will actually impact property value. Our county assessor periodically reevaluates real market value of various properties in our area, and a recent market value change discussed by a member of the public at the last hearing, it was based on the current metro mapping of that area, not any of the county draft maps that we had prepared. And we are going to be having ongoing conversations with A&T about our changes to our upland wildlife habitat areas since they don't prohibit development in the same way, and so we want to be clear on what those standards are with them. Yes?
Commissioner Will, go ahead.
I just have a quick question. A&T, I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, assessment and taxation. Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So a member of the development community requested that we consider, removing habitat areas on properties that received land use approval but have not yet been constructed or development has happened there, believing that it could cause confusion over the course of the land use approval and development process. After consulting with our current planning staff, we believe that the goalpost rule in ORS 215-427 preserves the decision that was reached with the preliminary land use approval, and that once the final plat is approved, the decision will would stand. We think that at this stage of preliminary approval, things could change, and approved projects do not always go through. So we would want the mapping that we have currently to stand in the event that that project falls through and a different outcome is available. Is a new application would have to be submitted for that applicant. Also, there was concern about the impacts of upland wildlife habitat mapping and the significant natural resource standards on underdeveloped residential lots that are less than 3 acres in size. The alternatives that were suggested would be to decrease the tree preservation points required on small lots or eliminate the mapped upland wildlife habitat on lots smaller than 3 acres.
Excuse me. Where did the alternatives come from? Who suggested them?
Those were included in the letter received on the issue by Matt Wellner. I think you received that letter on Monday or Tuesday.
I just wanted to be clear, they didn't come from staff.
No, staff's not. I guess they were suggested. So as you kind of think about those alternatives, I wanted to review the inventory methodology and the factors for the upland wildlife habitat and how we determine significance. When we consolidated the county and metro mapping and then we removed the following types of property. We removed residential lots that were under 1/2 acre. We removed developed areas that included structures and paved areas. We also removed isolated habitat patches that were under 2 acres in size, Isolated meaning they are not connected to any other habitat types or that they aren't connected to any of the riparian habitat areas. We then looked closely at the remaining habitat patches, and we retained the forested habitat patches that might be less than 2 acres, but were over a half an acre if there was oak habitat present, using the oak habitat layer. And we kept forested habitat that was adjacent to riparian wildlife habitat. We also removed fragmented habitat that had open tree canopy areas and edges. We retained patches that were in parks or open space that might be under that 2 acre threshold. We retained patches that overlapped with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife priority habitat connectivity areas, the intertwined habitat connectivity model, or whether they were a metro mapped habitat of concern. So there was a lot of evaluation that went on through these patches, and to take a look at removing parcels based on their habitat size would really throw into work a lot of reevaluation on what was remaining. And so we feel that that would really hamper the process at this point.
Commissioner Fry.
Can you? I'm trying to make sure I'm following this right, because it doesn't. We have limited views of these maps, and it's really hard to know what all is being impacted. But it doesn't feel like that was fully or accurately applied, even based on what Matt Wellner submitted to the Planning Commission as part of his public testimony. Because certainly some of those properties, again, I'm trying to like catch this on the fly, but a number of those properties feel like they should have been already removed from the maps based on these standards.
That could very well be the case in some circumstance. It's hard to tell through the evaluation process whether maybe some of those smaller patches also were priority habitat or had an oak habitat, so they might be smaller and retained. Since we received this such a short time ago, we didn't have a chance to really evaluate the rationale for each and every one of the examples that Mr. Wellner provided. We could do that, but we didn't really have that time at this point to fully evaluate what his request was.
I would say, though, looking at them, there's only one that I would say doesn't meet the criteria, and that's the one on Kearney Street, the 1.75 acres. And that one, we're not sure. It could have an oak there. That may be why it was left. It could be on one of those other maps. So we could check that one. But the other ones, I think, are all of a size. They're all larger than 2 acres, and or they do connect with riparian. So that's why they were retained.
Okay, and then so maybe a clarification on that. Even if the parcel is under 2 acres, if it's a number of contiguous parcels, the area is considered to be over 2 acres. So a property owner could have, an acre or something like that, but they could be next to somebody with more, and then they could now be held to this standard.
Yeah.
It's the habitat patch size that was focused on and not relying on where the tax lot boundaries are. But we did remove across the board as a first pass properties for upland habitat that were under a half an acre. And then if the habitat patch size was slivers or under 500 square feet, we also removed those properties. So,
Commissioner Kaiser.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to echo, and I want you to be able to continue your presentation. When we get done, I do want to go back and a little more slowly go through the mapping and just it was kind of quick for me, and I didn't get a chance to see everything I needed to see, and I think I missed something. So if we could just remember to do that and come back to it, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the comments that we've received about the degree of protection offered by the draft regulations. On the other end of the spectrum, some community members believe the level of riparian habitat protection is inadequate and too many uses are permitted in those areas. I would like to remind the Planning Commission that the Board of Commissioners directed staff to maintain the current level of protection consistent with Metro's Title 13, which is the Tualatin Basin Program. And the permitted uses for riparian wildlife habitat proposed by Ordinance Number 902 are a list of permitted uses in the current Community Development Code, except for the 2 proposed uses that allow alterations permitted or required by Clean Water Services, the Department of State Lands, or the Corps of Engineers. And although it's permitted, although these are listed permitted uses, it doesn't mean that there are not requirements on development applications and that the development is strictly to moderately limited within that area. For nearly 20 years, the county has required development follow the Tualatin Basin Program and Clean Water Services design and construction standards. So other public comments addressed in the staff report include the public utilities and transportation facilities in the upland wildlife habitat should not be exempt from the standards, that these activities should be regulated and mitigation should be required, that riparian wildlife habitat buffer width should be a minimum of 100 feet, and additional protections should be given to oak trees, heritage trees, trees in ODF and W priority connectivity areas, and other tree species. We stand by the standards as are written and do not support these changes. We reached an allow decision for transportation facilities and infrastructure as their need in the urban area outweigh the negative environmental impacts when balanced with connectivity and vehicle miles traveled and protection of habitat. Some thoughts on the tree points. Some thought the tree points were confusing and their basis was unclear. The citizens, or the Committee for Community Engagement, the Committee for
Community Involvement, yeah.
Was concerned that there were inadequate to offset detrimental impacts. And they had advocacy for retaining specific native species like white oak and assigning them more tree points in a way to incentivize their protection. We feel the greater the tree point total, the greater the incentive for preservation, and that would help with preservation rather than having to have replanting requirements. And so we have that as a baseline bonus in our tree point calculation. The city of Wilsonville's opinion was that our proposed regulations are too tree-centric without enough focus on understory health and quality of habitat. And I think we've kind of gone over the rationale for using trees versus consideration habitat and how difficult that is to have clear and objective standards for those. And there has been some concern expressed about enforcement and interest in increasing the maintenance period for newly planted trees beyond 2 years. So we believe that these provisions that we have outlined in our draft regulations appropriately balance natural resource protection with residential development and are kind of consistent with the lightly limit decision in the draft ESEE analysis. The tree point quantity specified by the regulation is a policy decision, so the greater the points, the greater the incentive for preservation, and the greater the replacement planting to help offset the impacts of tree removal. So at this time, we'd like to thank all of you out in our audience that have thoughtfully participated in our process by attending the open houses, answering surveys, testifying, asking your questions, and providing your point of view. We have thoughtfully considered each and every one of your comments and testimony over the course of this 2-year project. We know that the results have not gone far enough for some and too far for others. We hope in balance that it offers a middle ground on what it's meant to protect natural resources in our urban area. The more detailed response to comments are found in our staff report. There are slight modifications to the map and code language are proposed therein. Staff believes that the proposed policy and code changes in Ordinance 901 and 902 appropriately address the direction staff was given by the board and the requirements of the enforcement order issued by the Land Conservation and Development Commission. We feel that it meets the requirements of Goal 5 in Title 13, as I outlined in our draft ESE report, and it balances our statewide planning goals, including Goal 10, housing. At this time, we'd ask that the Planning Commission conduct the public hearing, and we recommend approval of Ordinance Number 901 to the Board of Commissioners with engrossment to include map change requests received by August 31st that are consistent with the criteria used to develop our inventory. We recommend that approval of Ordinance Number 902 to the Board with engrossment to address any changes that might be recommended by the Planning Commission. And we'd like you to consider any other items that have been submitted outside of the scope of the ordinance for possible discussion and recommendation to the board. And that includes the omnibus map correction ordinance toward the end of 2025 to address those corrections that we talked about that might come in after August 31st. The possible implementation task to work with County Council to develop any enforcement requirements, and possible interest in a heritage tree program. And at this time, I can go back to the map if you'd like to look at that a little bit more closely, the ALOA map. Did you have a particular, did you want to look at the consolidated one or the
if you could start on the first map and give us your explanation again and just take a little longer to track so I can catch up to it.
Okay, sure. Okay, so here we have part of the Aloha Reedville Community Plan mapping. This is, you have the Tualatin Hills Nature Park up at the top of the screen. You can kind of see TV Highway going there, going on the top part of the screen. To the right, to your right is the West Beaverton area. To the left would be the Hillsborough. So those dotted lines are the city boundaries. You can see where we have mapped the water areas and wetlands. Water areas and wetlands are the bright, kind of the lighter sky blue color. Water areas and wetlands and fish and wildlife habitat are the darker blue, bright blue colors. You can see the wildlife habitat in green along the hill there, and the streams that are kind of embedded in the wildlife habitat areas toward the south part of the screen up on Gassner Road. And I think it goes up until Southwest Banny. I never get that right. Banny. So that's those. Generally, in the 1980s, the maps looked at, for wildlife habitat, it's kind of defined as forested areas coincidental with water areas, or areas that were mapped by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife or the Portland Audubon Society, or one other map that I can't think of right now, but it's kind of determined in the code language that's there. And we looked at 5-acre forested areas was one of the thresholds. So just really those large areas that were undeveloped at the time in the 1980s. So those were all undeveloped areas. So in 2000, Metro did their riparian fish and wildlife habitat inventory. It included riparian wildlife habitat class 1 and 2, highest quality being 1 and 2, and upland wildlife habitat A and B. And they used GIS and a lot of different systems to identify these areas. These areas, when our consultant was looking at comparing our water, the county's mapped water areas versus Metro's areas, they determined that the Metro's areas were more accurate because it included GIS analysis and was more recent. So kind of swapped out our riparian for Metro's riparian. In some cases, the county's wildlife habitat was in fact mapped under closer examination as riparian habitat. So some of our wildlife habitat that we had mapped in the 1980s then kind of was reclassified to riparian habitat, and that happened. And in some cases, there continues to be overlap of where the county mapped wildlife habitat and where Metro mapped upland wildlife habitat. And this map kind of describes that hodgepodge. It keeps areas that it shows all of our initial area that's currently on our maps to this day, and along with Metro's mapping. So that's what this one kind of shows. And there's areas of overlap that are in kind of the forest green and a bright green. And if it's only mapped as upland habitat class A, it's in orange. And you can see there's kind of some of those areas nearby the riparian habitat down there. And then there's some areas that are upland B that, like the Jenkins Estates, for example, is one of those areas that is a class B upland habitat. Yes.
Commissioner Will?
Thank you, Chair. And so the point is the county decided not to stop here and just have a hodgepodge map. You wanted a more concise map. That's why we didn't stop at this point.
Right. So we took that map and then we used all of those factors that we talked about earlier, the developed areas, the upland habitat that is under, or the properties that are under half an acre, and areas with riparian where they've gone through the Clean Water Services process. They've had a land use application process. The riparian area, we know what it is. It's been delineated by Clean Water Services, and so we've kept those on our map and put in tracks. So a lot of the inventory are places that are already developed or protected in some way through a tract. And so this is the resulting inventory that you would see on your community plan map, but we're removing the colors, right? So we're keeping riparian for blue, and our upland habitat is shade of green. So in the community plan maps that you have before you for the natural resources, you'll see it in those colors. But I'm illustrating it here in what we, for the purposes of this exercise. It won't look like this in your community plan maps as drafted.
And so one of the things you see is that most of the area added for the Metro Upland A and B either overlapped with the county or is smaller areas next to the riparian or other wildlife habitat. There are a few that aren't, and so the one on here is the Jenkins Estate that Metro did map because they mapped all resources that were in parks. And so you'll see that in here. And then there are some others that are those larger habitat patches that were upland that are large treat areas that still remain that we our consultants, and we determined still has significance and we believe should be mapped.
Other questions? Commissioner Will.
I have a different question, not related to the map question, but Commissioner Kaiser may want to finish his questions about the map.
Go ahead.
Okay, I just had a question about, to clarify the report you gave, which I think is pretty significant concept. So a person who has a creek near their property 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they had to go through the Clean Water Services process to make sure that the creek, its buffers, the correct setbacks, riparian corridors were protected. And so what these ordinances are saying is that process is all still in effect. So I know there's a lot of public comment that was concerned that it's not going to protect those resources.
Well, in some cases, a property may not have gone through Clean Water Services if it was constructed, like, let's say, in the 1960s.
Oh, yeah.
So they might have a creek back behind their property that hasn't been delineated. It's just one of a stream. If that property were wanting to come in for development or be divided, then they would need to go through a Clean Water Services process, which which has been the case for about 20 years now.
Yeah. Okay. So this is clear that this ordinance is not eliminating any of those existing improvements. What it sounds to me like a lot of things this ordinance is doing is identifying the upland areas and creating a process for those. So it's like an additional clarity. So it's not trying to rewrite the rules that people have already been experiencing in the last 5-10 years working with CWS.
Sure. So
Correct.
right. So our process really wasn't clear on that. Although we had added these lands are subject to these maps are subject to our standards, which were Clean Water Service requirements for riparian habitat. So that's staying the same. We're just really making sure everybody is aware of that. And then for upland wildlife habitat, we had a standard that was subjective. And so we were tasked with looking at, by the board, to say, where is this wildlife habitat now, moving forward? And so we used the existing inventories that we already had access to kind of take a look at that again, using those inventories.
If I could follow up on that. So thinking of upland areas, and I don't need to quote too many of the public comments, but there was an agency comment that stated that you kind of went above and beyond the remand, or that you took a reassessment of the maps, so this process before this ordinance, somebody who had a property that was mapped by Metro and was not included in this first set of 3 maps you just showed us. How did the Metro layer affect their hypothetical development application? Was there any impact on their application? The fact that they were designated by Metro but not by the county as upland?
Well, it would depend on whether the property was added to the urban growth boundary before or after 2005. So Metro said, moving forward, after we adopt this ordinance of Title 13, new areas added to the urban growth boundary after 2005 will have to have regulations in place for upland A and B. And so we're following through with that requirement. If I think I understand your
that's
question.
very clear.
Did I miss?
I was just thinking on I think one of the problems is that it was confusing to people. There was the set of Metro maps, there were our maps. Our regulations said that if you're on Metro's map, you are subject to our regulations, but it wasn't clear which categories, and we didn't have those maps on our website. And so a big part of this is trying to bring that all together and lessen the confusion about what people were subject to. But they were always subject to definitely the riparian, the metro riparian mapping and the metro riparian requirements. The upland, as Michelle said, I think for pre-2005, upland wasn't required to be regulated. It is required for areas added to the UGB after. The county always had some wildlife habitat. We always did regulate some level, and the board asked us to look at what do we have now, what resources do we have now, and update those for us. So that's what it was, the Department of Land Conservation and Development that said that they supported what we had done, but we did do something more than we had to do under the enforcement order, because the board wanted to know, what do we have left? What resources do we have left? And which ones merit protection now? So we did a more comprehensive look than we had to, because the board wanted an update after 40 years.
So now if this ordinance moves forward with these maps, those maps will be more clear, is what I hear you saying. Can you confirm if somebody had a property that was annexed prior to that date you said, I think it was 2005, and their property was not previously mapped by the county, but now that the metro layer is added, and now they are, did you say the ordinance has two separate procedures for them? Or does this ordinance now add a requirement for them to meet a review process, or are they still exempt? Is I guess my question. Like you said before, this ordinance it doesn't apply to them because the metro only applies to after 2005. Is that correct?
So metro requires us to have regulations for those post-2005 areas. For areas that are pre-2005, we aren't required by metro to have any standards in place for upland wildlife habitat. But we had local resource, what's called local wildlife habitat.
Correct.
So in the process, the metro upland wildlife habitat that's mapped becomes our local resource where we're having regulations. That's why the percentage is a bit lower than what's required in those post-2005 areas. It's the determination of the lightly limit decision. And that's all addressed in the Goal 5 report, where we balanced all of the different factors.
And Chair Lockwood, thanks for letting me ask these questions. Just one last angle on that. So there was also public comment and concern of the exceptions for public utilities, and you guys addressed that, why you feel it's a good balance. But I want to clarify, so if a road wants to be built through an upland habitat, staff pretty much said that there's some benefits sometimes to that transportation network or utility network of efficiencies. So on whole, the staff are recommending to allow that exception. But if they want to blow right through a wetland, they still have to go through the Clean Water Services process, right? Like you can't just build a road through a creek or wetland without going through a process.
Right, I think.
In that case, actually, it would be the Department of State Lands, and they would have to delineate the wetland, and they probably wouldn't be able to do anything within that. Or if they did, they would have to mitigate it quite a bit. So we have had situations like that. Up in North Bethany, there was a wetland that wasn't realized it was a wetland when we did our planning. When they went to potentially develop, it was identified as a wetland, so they had to delineate it, and pretty much that's Shackelford Road. It has not been built because it needs to be on pylons and all of that to avoid the impacts.
But the exceptions we're talking about in here are more talking about the wetlands to the upland impacts. Normally, a private developer would have to go through tree point counts and try to preserve trees, and that's what we're talking about when we're talking about exceptions in this ordinance, is exceptions to upland impacts. as opposed to
I think I
exceptions to
understand.
the
I think
wetland
that
index.
answer is yes. We're saying that the through a roadway, any trees that are planned within that roadway wouldn't need to be inventory or wouldn't be subject to the points.
Yes, okay.
So it could be
I thought it was
designed
just good
as
to ask that
they
question.
want to.
I understood that too, but some of the public comments sounded like they were afraid that the exception allowed, just to blow right through resource areas, and that's not necessarily true. It's just there are still protections for those resource areas. It's just maybe the upland trees won't be protected.
That's right.
Okay, thank you appreciate that. Thanks,
Commissioner-
Chair Lockwood.
Commissioner Kaiser.
Thank you, Chair. I have several questions, but I'm gonna go back to the utility one that Commissioner Wells was talking about first. I didn't hear. I understand the road side of this, but what about when we talk about public utility and the benefit from public utility? Is that for all public utilities, electric, everybody, or is it just county related and state related public utilities? I mean, power companies exist in this weird spot where they're kind of public and kind of not. So I was just wondering how that applies to them.
Michelle's looking up the code section, unless
problem.
our consultant knows off the top of her head.
I was just going to double check it as well. The intention is that it's that, for example, tree removal along a power line corridor would be appropriate, that there might not be an opportunity for the electric utility to mitigate those trees, place those trees on site because they maybe just have an easement and they don't have land outside of that easement. But that for safety reasons, for example, removing the trees adjacent to the power lines would be appropriate. So we had concerns such as that. So yes, I think the intention is that it's not just county-owned utilities, but it would be other public utilities.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
And I would refer you to section 422 4.3 C. And then B is the public transportation facilities.
And so that talks about sanitary and storm sewer and water lines, electric communication and signal lines, and gas distribution and transmission lines. And most
Thank
of
you.
those are not provided by the county, but by other utilities.
Okay, I want to mapping wise, if we could, since we have the map up still, I'm looking at a parcel right now. One thing I want to say about this map, first of all, thank you guys for doing this. I know it's not the easiest thing in the world to do, and I just, for me, the visual helps a lot. I am looking at this parcel right here as an example, and I'm just using this one as an example. This is off 175th Avenue, just south of Riggert Road. And this particular parcel, I wish I could show you it on Google. First of all, the size of this map makes these areas look incredibly tiny, but in terms of acreage, there is significant acreage in some of those spots, right? And that's, I get it, perspective is part of the deal, but I just want to point that out. I think it's important that people understand that. But when I look at this parcel, I'm looking at a parcel that has 3 large homes on it, and then it is significantly, it has a great tree canopy and a great tree cover. It's great. But on 3 sides of it, it's fully developed with subdivisions. And growing up in that area, I know that every one of those areas looked exactly like that particular property, right? I understand that standards change as we go. Nothing stays the same forever. I mean, if everybody was grandfathered in on every regulation forever, well, we'd never have any more regulation, right? So I understand that. What my stress here when I'm looking at this particular parcel is, under this standard, I don't think this parcel is ever developable now, just from the standpoint of the amount of trees you would have to replace on site. And in some respects, it's a major change and a major shift. And that's what gets me to the next point I have, which is are we sure that we're using, does county staff feel like what we've arrived at is going to be a clear and objective standard that the state will uphold? In particular, where I keep coming back to is, you know, a great example is the bonus for oaks or the bonus for stuff within 100 feet. Somebody pointed out, I think you said that was a policy decision. To me, what would make that a clear and objective standard other than the fact that we assigned 8 points to it, right? I mean, that's what I'm trying to understand. What makes it objective?
And that might also be a nice one for Kathy to.
Yeah, thank you. So what makes it objective is that any two people applying it would reach the same conclusion. So the math that is, so the way clear and objective standards work, right, is they should be mathematical, they should be otherwise black and white. So it's a yes, no, something like that. So that's the idea, is that any two people applying that standard can reach that conclusion. Hopefully that's the case, right? I think that we've done a good job of saying, if it is this species, that's a yes, no, it gets this many points. The policy choice is how many points should it get, right? If we believe that that species is relative to every other native tree that we're protecting, that is a regulated tree, right? So they're all of our native trees are over a certain size are going to be considered regulated trees if they're in that habitat area. Some of them, based on what we heard in the community, had high value because of their species. So it's like, okay, above and beyond just what you would get as the tree would earn for its size, which it gets a point for each inch of diameter, it would get extra points, right? So that means that a relatively small oak, relatively small in diameter, would have additional points. And that's true for a larger one as well, although proportionately it's less in the overall score. So again, it's objective because it is, there's no debate about the result. But it is a policy choice with regard to this legislative process that you're going through now about how much that whether that particular species deserves extra points and so forth.
So forgive me, guys, has this been kicked back twice or 3 times?
Once.
Or just once?
Rob may want to answer that because he made a statement this morning I was surprised at.
It depends on what you mean by kicked back. It's been to LCDC twice, and it's been to LUBA. Well, it depends on how you count it, 4 times.
Oh, okay.
But the ordinance itself has only been kicked back once. 869B is what was kicked back. There's just a lot of process involved.
So it's fair to say we're struggling with what the clear and objective standard is, and we know that my big goal is to make sure this doesn't come back again, right? That's what I'm mostly concerned about. I think staff probably agrees with it. They're probably tired of talking about it. So
this lawyer agrees with you as well. My goal is to make this sure this doesn't come back.
Yeah, totally. So from that perspective, Catherine, is it a risk to assign additional points to an oak or to anything else? Or is that a standard that has passed muster before?
I don't think that there is, from a clear and objective perspective, and of course, county council should correct me if they think I'm incorrect on this. I think it is perfectly appropriate for the county to write clear and objective standards that implement your policies. And if your policy is that certain species are a priority species, we've written clear and objective, which we believe. We've heard that. We've written clear and objective standards that implement those policies. So that is appropriate. As far as my understanding of how LUBA would interpret this. But again, I'm not an attorney, so I'll leave it there.
Would you agree, Rob?
I would agree with that, generally speaking. I am not, however, going to guarantee we won't get this kicked back for a whole myriad of potential reasons. But my focus is really on making sure that whatever we produce in the end is clear and objective. And of course, in this particular context, that becomes extremely challenging. And that's why we're here on a remand from LUBA, because 869B wasn't precisely clear and objective. So here we are.
Chair, I have some additional questions, but I don't want to monopolize time, so I'm going to put my hand down for a little bit, and I'll come back around.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Commissioner Fry.
I wanted to kind of add something to Commissioner Kaiser's question about the site on 175th being potentially undevelopable. I think we provided a clear and objective path with the tree points, but there's also two other options that are available to development applications. And so if that site isn't penciling, so to speak, for the clear and objective path, they can't use any of the adjustments, don't work to make it pencil. There's also the tree canopy approach, and so that has a certain percentage of preservation area that might make it more feasible to add some development to those lots.
That is, I think it's important. I think it's important what you're saying, because I think I missed that a little bit in the respect that it can be an either or part of the process, not and. Right? It's not both. It's just either or. You can kind of make some choices there.
Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily a clear and objective path, the canopy approach, and it doesn't need to be, as long as we have one approach that's clear and objective. And it's an option that a developer can choose. They can decide to do adjustments. They can decide to dedicate property. So that's their alternative.
It's good to know those options exist. I appreciate that.
I have lots of questions, and then as we're talking, more and more things keep popping up, and I'm not sure how much is appropriate to save for deliberations and how much we just kind of get into as we're going through all these slides together. Kind of on the line that Commissioner Will was going through earlier, this is one of my major questions on the pre-2005 and applying new rules that weren't mandated to be applied to pre-2005 lands. That feels risky to me. I can, we've kind of touched on some of the things where people have had these expectations for the land for all this time, and that's being changed. And yes, regulations change, but this is a choice. We have post 2006, however our 2005-2006 language is supposed to be phrased. We have that where we have to do this, right? Or we have to, Title 13, make sure, Title 13 applies to those. So we now need to make those clear and objective, which sounds fun, and meet that. But the stuff prior to that, these pre-2005, if we're now creating these new standards, I feel like it's there. I have questions about that decision in general, but I also have, as we're discussing this as a planning commission, what is the county opening itself up to? What are the potential challenges and lawsuits? Because part of this is because of legal challenges that we're having this conversation at all. I kind of see the opposite side of legal challenges coming if these are applied by choice when they didn't have to be.
So if I could maybe address the first part of that question, which is the 2017 legislation that changed the law and requires us to change our standards to clear and objective, did not delineate between 2005 pre and post. It didn't draw that distinction. So we have to change all of our standards that are subjective, whether they apply to pre-2005 or post-2005. The distinction there is because the Title 13 also applies post-2005, and so the clear and objective standards will be different than the clear and objective standards for before, but we have to change them all because all the subjective standards have to be altered.
And a little bit to your question, it seems like we had standards in place, as Rob indicated, for significant natural resources. You could see that we had wildlife habitat that was mapped on our inventory, and that would continue. The place where I think that, and so those are from the 1980s, have continued to today. They continue to be mapped habitat. Those are not new, so to speak. But the areas where there's the metro that wasn't on our mapping, those are new, but those are all inventoried under the same criteria as determined to be significant. So that decision's made, and I think what you're asking, and maybe whether we need to add new areas, and we're following the process. Goal 5 is a process, so we've inventoried and we followed the correct process there, and adding areas to the overlay, following the process by using the Goal 5 ESEE analysis, and that's what will potentially be called into question. Did we follow the correct process? That's one of the issues for having the overlay on there. And then another question is, are these regulations clear and objective? So there's a lot of steps. We want to make sure we're following the correct process, and if we are, then we can change and add areas that were from Metro's inventory to our inventory if they've met that inventory methodology and criteria. So that's.
So on that then, I know we have some of the numbers in here, and I don't know if because you probably dream about all this stuff, how much time you spend on it. I don't know if you have it memorized, but specifically in the pre-2005, how many acres of riparian, or not, excuse me, not riparian, of upland were identified prior, and how many are here now? And what I'm getting at is this potentially changed, and if I remember my numbers right, which I'm not going to try and quote them, I think it changed significantly.
Well, I don't know what you mean by significant, but I would just refer you to the numbers in the draft inventory report, and they haven't really separate. You're asking what areas are the pre-2005 areas that are
in the pre-2005? What was the acreage of upland habitat compared to what the new mapping would have it as? And I guess part of the tricky thing in that is that a lot of that stuff had been previously developed, so you have to kind of ignore the stuff that's already been developed and kind of look at what's remaining for that and say how much stuff that hasn't already been developed in this inventory, what's the acreage, what are we expanding onto that stuff, I guess.
Right, and we don't necessarily have all of that that have development potential. I don't think we've run that specific type of number to kind of parse it out in the way that you're wanting to have it. We don't know like that Jenkins Estate area. It's not really going to be residential development, right? It's going to stay a park, and that's one of the large areas that will is not kind of something that we want to identify as a significant natural resource.
That could skew the number that you're asking.
Yeah. And so we haven't done the analysis of what that potential use is for those specific areas.
So as we have the various points and impacts, and this is +1, this is -1, this is 0, as you go through that, it feels hard to even know how to assign that in terms of, and I'm thinking in housing in particular on that list, and if we don't even know how much development potential was lost there, how can we say what the impact to housing was on that? Because, and don't get me wrong, I care greatly about our environment, but we also are, we're in need of housing for people, and that's a big responsibility that we all have to ensure as well. So if we're going to impact housing, how do we assign a number to that if we don't actually know how many acres we maybe just, quote, lost?
I think we do have some of the numbers in the ESCE.
Yeah, so we did talk about this at one of the 3 or 4 work sessions that we had, and we've done so many presentations, so I've got the last couple ones, but not that one. But we did have a table with, I think, some of the information you're looking for. The table that I'm finding right now that's in the inventory report includes, in the upland class A, it includes the overlap with wildlife habitat, so it doesn't pull that out. But I believe we did have a table. And I see that Kathy has her hand up. She may have
Ms. Corliss,
access
go
to
ahead.
that.
I was just going to direct you to table 3-2 in the Goal 5 report. And that is showing us the acreage that was subject to the ESCE analysis. So if you think about things that are subject to, divide the resources into two categories. There's the things that are subject to Title 13, and there's acreage that we applied the standard Goal 5 process to, which are things that are subject to the ESCE analysis. So that's primarily that upland habitat that was not in the post 2005 urban growth boundary expansion area. So it's in the old UGB, right? And so if you look at that table, you see a breakdown by land use district. Then we've generalized and categorized those. So if you're looking at that, you can see the breakdown, and that the bulk of the acreage is in the what we call other urban, which is primarily your residential zones and so forth. And so that acreage is the acreage affected basically by the ESCE. Now, what gets tricky, and the reason we didn't translate that directly to residential dwelling units, is some of that is obviously going to be parks, either today or in the future. Some of that's going to be streets and roads. Some of that are going to be exempt. Some of that land is going to be in utility corridors, which are going to be exempt. So again, it's not, we could take it and we could say it's this many acres in each zone, and these are the densities in those zones, and we could take out 20% for utilities and streets and roads, and we could do a very rough back of the envelope calculation, but I don't know how meaningful that would be. It would most certainly be wrong. It would be very, very rough. But I mean, if that's helpful, we can do that for the commission. I just I hesitated to do it because I was afraid it would be so inaccurate, because there's so many caveats in that calculation. However, you can see the acreage. We do know which lands were subject to that ESCE.
One quick
If that's
thing,
helpful.
I'll pause for a minute after that. But it sounds like it's safe to say that it's acknowledged that the greatest impact is on residential housing.
Yes, because the ESCE I think that's true. We concluded in the ESCE that things in the lands in the high intensity urban category would get an allow. And so those lands actually came off of the map. And that was only about 32 acres. Again, that's an estimate based on some of that might be parks and so forth. But that land was received an allow, so that actually came off of the maps, the regulatory maps. So yes, I would say there are some institutional lands in that other urban category. And so, but it's primarily, if you look at the category, it's primarily the residential lands. So yes, the answer is certainly, it would be mostly housing.
Okay, thank you. I'll take a break from my questions.
Commissioner Rosenberry.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to follow up because I'm a very visual person. What we've been talking about, areas that are not previously regulated but are now going to be regulated, those showing on the current map on the screen, the slide on the screen, those are the yellow and orange. Am I accurately translating?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I do have a question, and I don't know. This is something that I'm sure people are going to be curious about. does that change the allowed use for those properties? As an example, if you have a residence in the yellow or the orange and you have horses or goats or some sort of agriculture, does this change what's allowable?
No.
I appreciate that. And then in the slides 17, 18, when we were talking about removable trees that are very specific to homes, if I have a barn and my horses are in danger from a tree that's starting to deteriorate, am I not allowed to remove that tree to protect their safety?
So is it a hazardous tree, a disease or dying tree? Then that is exempt.
Okay, what if I wanted to add a pasture or a workout, flatten some land so that we could exercise on site?
And remove trees in the significant habitat area. You could use a 5,000 square foot disturbance area on the property to remove any trees that you want to within that area. If it exceeds the 5,000 square foot of disturbance area, then you would need to apply for a type 2 permit. You might need, if you're removing 10 or fewer trees, you would just need to replace all of the tree points that are of the regulated trees. If there would be one example of what you could do to get your workout area.
Perfect. I just know those are questions that are probably going to be asked because it's changes to how those properties are viewed. Thank you.
Sure.
Pardon me?
Are we done with this topic? Would it be okay if I moved on to a subject change?
Homeowner, of the developer. Sorry, I'm sorry. Thank you, whoever turned that on. Did you do that? Thank you. So I just want to understand. So if let's say I have property that is in the orange or yellow. Let's not use chickens. That's not a good example. But so I go in and I'm like, I want to build an apartment complex, and but I have upland areas. I will receive a level of guidance about, like, here's what you can do. I guess like all these different colors, right? They're confusing, but that's not what they're going to see. They're going to see, like, these are the new rules for these areas. And then there's also people, just like with the barn example, like that there's things that they have property now that has been identified that's new, and they're going to have a new set of rules, but they have been informed of it with all this stuff. And now when they go, if they want to build something on their property, they now have a map, a set of guides, clear and objective guides, and like costs associated with each thing.
Right. There's certain levels, depending on the level of activity or development that they're going to do, there'll be certain permit requirements. Starting at an exemption where staff would just need to look and to see a certificate that the tree is dying or diseased that you want to remove, dead, diseased, or dying tree.
A certificate from like an arborist.
Correct. Or then you'd move up to a type 1 if you were wanting to remove trees in that disturbance area we talked about. If within that area, that would be a type 1 type of process, kind of administratively over the counter process. And then depending on the extent of the development you're proposing, like an apartment complex, that would, in our case, it would be a type 2 or greater, depending on what else you're proposing in the area, and what other standards might trigger a higher level of review. And a type 2 would be you'd need to do a tree inventory and show the trees that are on the site and the trees that you're planning on removing. And then you'd have to follow the tree point guidance.
How much is a type 1 permit?
I think
The type 1 tree removal was something like $450, I believe. Type 2s, we don't have a type 2 tree removal right now, so we would be looking at what that might be.
Is that $450 per tree, for a couple trees?
The type 2 would be for the site, so you would be looking at a development, so you would do a development permit application and look at that for the whole site. If it was just removing trees, that's why we're thinking, well, we probably need to look at a type 2 just for that, and that would be probably quite a reduced process. And so we don't have a fee established yet for that. But we do, when someone comes in and says, this is what I would like to do, we'll help them as much as we can at the counter, and then we'll oftentimes set up a pre-application conference. And when we do that, we get other staff involved, other sections of our department, and then we gather all of the different code sections that might apply and write that out and give that to an applicant so they have more of a roadmap of what would be required.
Thank you.
Oh, we've got, I think, 3 commissioners with questions, but I think Commissioner Kaiser's been waiting for his.
I can add on that.
You'd like to add on that?
exact topic.
That
really
exact
fast, and
topic.
then
All right.
provide it.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
Thank you. So we're a $450 cost. So somebody has a hazard tree, right? We're saying it's a $450. No, okay, that's not the type 1 that you said. Okay.
right, that's an exemption. So that's going to be something new that we don't have a fee set up for yet. What the cost of that is going to be, if any. We'll be submitting the arborist verification that that's a hazard, diseased, or dying tree.
And then it's another tree removal within 10 feet or whatever the other ones are that requires the $450 type 1.
At this time, the type 1 is a type 1 review is $450, and so that we'll have to match the amount of level of effort that staff is spending on the review and come up and decide on the appropriate fee.
They have the expense of the arborist, which is arguably not a new expense, maybe, I don't know. And then they have the cost to remove it. They don't have an additional permit cost. If it's one of the ones that's within the allowable type 1 process, they're going to have to follow that. They're going to have the type 1 fee of maybe $450, and then they're going to have their removal cost. So there's some burden to a homeowner for it. And then just a quick other comment is the county staff is wonderful. They're very helpful. However, if you're going to be developing an apartment or something like that, and especially as you add additional standards, you end up hiring consultants and paying an increase in costs to determine all of these things. So that's one last comment on the cost questions and the process comments, and now I'll be quiet again. Thank you.
Madam Chair, I just want to note it is 8 o'clock. You've been in the staff report, believe it or not, for an hour and a half. There's still more questions, which is fine, but we haven't even opened the public hearing. And I just wanted to note for the chair, I don't know if there are people who might want to testify. We can always return to staff questions too, but you might also want to consider a break.
Thank you for that. Clerk Aguilar, do we have people signed up?
We do. We have a total of 4 people who have signed up in advance, 2 online and 2 in person.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to suggest, since we've been here for 90 minutes, we usually take a 5-minute break at 90 minutes. And then I would suggest we go into our public hearing and then come back to our questions. Without objection, that's what we'll do. or do we? Okay, thank you. All right, at this point, I'd like to open the public hearing. And Clerk Aguilar, will you go ahead with calling the people who want to testify?
Thank you, Chair. We have 4 total in-person and online who have signed up in advance. That's 2 people that have signed up in person and 2 online. We'll start with people attending in person. Once I call your name, please come to the front table and state your name and address for the record. Then proceed with your testimony. Jean?
With a 3-minute allowance, correct?
Yes, Jean Shaw? Okay, thank you. Next, we have Miki Blizzard. Miki, can you please state your name and address for the record, please?
Will do, Susan. Yes, my name is Miki Blizzard. I live at 16815 Southwest Pleasant Valley Road in Beaverton. Actually, it's unincorporated Washington County in the Kenton area. And I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to testify on this proposed ordinance. I know a lot of work has gone into it, and I have to commend staff and also the commissioners for the discussion. It's very instructive, very educational, because a lot going on here. And I was encouraged that the latest draft included some stronger language than the previous draft did, because I feel that the ordinance should really be something that preserves and protects our significant natural resources. As all of you know, once they're gone, and the county depends on it on so many different levels. My big concern is that about the public utilities and transportation facilities, the exemption for those for the upland areas, saying that we need to balance connectivity and lower VMT, both of which I'm in great favor of, but to sacrifice significant natural resources for those without even giving them a clear exemption, I think is a mistake. If we should put them in there as having to follow the rules and provide any mitigation, and of course those would have to be at clear and objective standards. But to just kind of give them a pass, assuming that they are needed, I think that puts the burden back on you, certainly for every transportation facility that's required, to make sure that they do these things. And again, once the natural resources are gone, they're gone. So I just encourage you to do everything you can to preserve and protect, understanding that exemptions and even mitigations is kind of a fallback situation rather than a starting point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else in the auditorium wanting to speak on this item? If so, please raise your hand. Please come forward to the table and state your name and address.
Shirley Evers, Forest Grove. I definitely want to be supportive in saving our resources, and also hopefully we stop taking our farmland at the same time. I don't think we need to do a lot more building. We can't live off cement. But I noticed on your people that wrote in that they're asking if they can have more time to get the maps right, because there seems to be a lot of things that are still not in the mapping. Man, that was long. You guys all went through for an hour and a half. And I was just wondering, are you planning, I don't think you read these out loud, but do you plan to look at giving it a little bit more time to get all the information? To get more information, because it sounds like what they're talking about is that there's more information out there that you've not got it all, and that it needs to be more corrected. Just wondering.
So this is not a back and forth.
Oh, okay. That's my comment. Didn't know how it all worked. But I definitely want to know that we're saving our resources, but also saving our farmland. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we'll move to online testimony. We have 2 people signed up to speak on this item. Joanne Delmonico?
Yes, hi. I'm Joanne Delmonico, and I live at 9601 Northwest Leahy Road. And I just wanted to comment, or I wasn't able to, I got here a little late, and I don't know if the ordinance was amended since the last meeting to add anything regarding enforcement of particularly the mitigated areas. So on Ordinance 902 in section 422-9.7, it says the applicant's responsible for ensuring a minimum of 80% of the trees and shrubs planted remain alive on the second anniversary of that date, that the mitigation planning is completed. If this level is not met, replanting is required to meet the 80% survival requirement. I'm just commenting that I know on a property adjacent to our property that is an SNR area, that didn't happen. I don't know that the county has resources to check on these areas or to do any follow-up and see that this regulation is happening. And I don't see anything in here that's clear to me that there is resources to be able to check on these mitigated areas. I'm curious about whether the LUT did any sort of research and looking at the areas in the past that mitigation's been done and how successful they were. So I guess it's a question really, is there resources in the county for people to be checking other than the homeowners and the developers on these mitigated areas? So that these saplings and, things, the resources aren't wasted, but also that these trees that are replanted, planted trees are surviving. So I guess that's my question and comment that I'm curious, and I don't see in here how they carry out that enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Eve Goldman from Tualatin River Keepers.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Good evening, commissioners. My name is Eve Goldman. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director for the Tualatin River Keepers. TRK's advocacy in water quality and the overall health of the Tualatin River watershed leads us to closely monitor regulations that involve significant natural resources. While we are encouraged by the work that Washington County is doing towards coming into compliance with Goal 5, TRK is concerned that the proposed ordinances do not adequately protect SNRs. So I'm here to express TRK's opposition to ordinance numbers 901 and 902 as currently written. In my written testimony, I provide a lot of our various concerns, but I'm just going to address a couple of our primary concerns and potential solutions as time is limited. Our first primary concern is the inadequate riparian buffers that are established in Ordinance 902, Section 422-8.1. Riparian buffers are crucial to mitigating climate change effects and protecting ecosystems from pollution and erosion from developments that are being built too close to these wetlands, streams, and riparian habitats that are important and critical as significant natural resources. Under methodology 2 for determining the riparian wildlife habitat boundaries, the minimum riparian buffer is listed as 50 feet for all water areas except the Tualatin River, which has a minimum riparian buffer width of 125 feet. While methodology 2 permits the riparian buffer to extend to a maximum of 200 feet, This buffer range does not provide adequate protection of these habitats. There are several other land use ordinances around the state, including the Columbia River Gorge Commission, that recommends a minimum of 200 feet for wetlands and banks of fish-bearing waterways. Further, buffers intended to provide wildlife habitat should be a minimum of 100 feet according to the ODFW's Oregon Conservation Strategy. A second concern we have is the deficient examination of cumulative impacts of the development projects on significant natural resources. The ordinances as currently drafted fail to consider the total burden that all developmental projects will have. Assessing each project individually is insufficient. As we know, combined effects of multiple developments can exacerbate negative impacts and counter mitigation efforts. So some additional protections that could address these cumulative impacts include creating higher mitigation thresholds for SNRs in areas that have already endured significant upstream impacts. So that's all I have time for. I see I have some more time. Finally, our third primary concern is Ordinance 902, Section 422-4.3's broad exemptions of tree removal within upland wildlife habitat. This section is particularly concerning as it seems to infer that public entities are exempt from restrictions on development and tree removal within riparian habitats. And I'll read the language that is concerning in terms of listing the activities associated with tree removal permitted, including construction, maintenance, and repair of public park improvements or projects, construction, maintenance, and repair of public transportation facilities, including but not limited to streets, street crossings, and roads, installation, maintenance, or construction of sanitary and storm sewer water lines, electric communication and signal lines, and gas distribution lines, as well as mineral extraction operations within mineral and aggregate sites. So while these are all important things that society needs to function, however, these broad exemptions within this upland wildlife habitat does not adequately align with Goal 5's mission of protecting significant natural resources from new construction and development. So for these reasons and for more, the TRK opposes ordinance numbers 901 and 902 as currently written. Thank you so much for your time and for considering our concerns.
Thank you for testifying.
Would anyone else online like to testify on this item? If so, please raise your virtual hand. Okay, it looks like we have two. Matt Wellner.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Can you please state your name and address for the record?
Yeah, it's Matt Wellner, and the address is 14815 Southwest 141st Avenue in Tigard, Oregon 97224. I just wanted to take a minute to say thank you for all your time. I know that you've invested a lot into both these ordinances because there's a lot of material there, and I've been on your side of the desk, and I know it's hard work, and I want to say I appreciate all the work you put into it. So. And it's evidence from a lot of your questions that you've done your homework too. So you guys have already referenced my letter, the letter I submitted yesterday. I apologize for it coming in late. It's just it took me a bit to get to it. I hope for those of you that haven't read it, please do. It'll only take a minute. There's a lot of good visuals that kind of help you to drill down to the parcel level. It's hard to understand kind of the true impact of these new maps and these new rules until you drill down to the parcel level. It's hard to look at it from a 10,000 foot and see these corridors and see these colors, and when you can't actually see parcel lines and see where overlays didn't exist and they do today. And I spent a couple hours kind of flying around the county's map, which is a great tool. And comparing that map to the community plans, the SNR overlay shown on those community plans. And what you'll see in a lot of areas is trees that now have overlays, trees that now have protections next to subdivisions that were developed over the last 20, 30 years. I'm not an advocate for cutting trees, but I am an advocate for property rights, and it's hard to see properties being treated differently under these new regulations than their neighbors were treated, especially when a lot of those properties are smaller in nature, difficult to develop. They've been around a long time because they do have challenges, admittedly, but just within the last 3 years, we've adopted new middle housing regulations that will make a lot of those properties more approachable, more developable, make them easier to pencil. And my concern is that with these new SNR regulations, those opportunities are going to dry up just because there are challenges there. And when you create mitigation requirements, when you require a protection of 50% of that upland habitat, it's just the one thing that pushes it over the edge. And even with adjustments, even with exceptions, they still are too difficult to make work. So I'm hopeful that you'll, I guess, be considerate of those smaller infill development opportunities, and you'll look for ways to soften the blow of these ordinances on those parcels. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Next, we have Aaron Nichols. Aaron, can you please state your name and address for the record and then proceed with your testimony?
Thank you. Good evening, Chair Lockwood, members of the Planning Commission. My name is Aaron Nichols. I live at 11,000 Northwest Jackson Quarry Road, Hillsboro, Oregon, 97124. I'm a vegetable farmer north of Hillsboro and east of North Plains. I've spoken here before regarding North Plains' UGB expansion, and on behalf of Friends of North Plains Smart Growth, I'd like to just quickly bring a few of the lessons we learned while working for smarter growth and protecting lands as they relate to this discussion. Those here from the CCI and Riverkeepers and other advocates have spoken very well and better than I can to the specific flaws in Ordinance 901 and 902, but I just wanted to discuss how we all benefit from an ordinance that would truly protect our vanishing significant natural resources. The SNRs we're discussing here, wild and working lands, the habitats and the soils that will feed us in the future are irreplaceable and they're integral to our quality of life, as you all know. Though we've lost a lot of the mapped SNRs, the ones that remain are of immense value. They're some of the very best soils, some of the very best, most important habitats in Washington County. Though I think a balance needs to be struck, we do need to start with the realization that we're already teetering on one extreme side of the scales, the side that favors more building and fewer SNRs. So we need to protect what we have left, and we need to be able to pass that down to future generations. But I think there's another reason for a stronger ordinance, a stronger 901 and 902, more enforceable, and with more clear lines around who is included and who is not. Because I've seen what happens when when cities or counties try to pass ordinances with a goal of making it easier to develop in places people do not want developed. That's what happened in North Plains. And it was broadly rejected by the community. Sorry, I think the massive development, paving over open spaces they're not popular in our county. And I worry that if we pass weak protections for SNRs in hopes of being able to kind of bypass Goal 5 and develop lands the majority would like to see protected, we not only fail to protect the SNRs, but we're not making a clear and viable path for future needed development. If rather than protecting and providing clarity of what we want protected and drawing boundaries around these important areas, we leave it up to resistance in individual communities to stop development and protect their own SNRs, we have a much more difficult system. While I think that resistance would likely be successful in many places, as we were in North Plains, and as the advocates were in the Tile Flat Road expansion, we think we'd still be left with a patchwork that makes development difficult and doesn't fully protect the SNRs that need to be protected as a unit to be most effective and most efficient. I think a stronger, clearer ordinance benefits us all, and I encourage you to take the careful comments from the advocates here to reject or rework 901 or 902. And I appreciate your time and your work on this issue. Thank you for doing the hard work of being on the Planning Commission. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair Lockwood, we have nobody else signed up to speak on this item.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to close the public hearing at this point, and we'll continue with our questions for staff. So Commissioner Rosenberry, well, is Commissioner, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Chair. I did want to follow up. I know we had asked the question about potentially bonding the projects to ensure that trees are taking root and coming to fruition. Was that considered in any way?
So we do have provisions in the ordinance for bonding for installation of the trees and the planting. The provisions in the so there are the three options: the clear and objective path, and then the two other options for the environmental report option. That does also provide bonding for the maintenance period. And we saw that because that provision didn't need to be clear and objective, and so we felt we could craft it in a way that provided for that. But the other one, the clear and objective path, only includes the installation. And I know Kathy and I had talked about that. I don't know, Kathy, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Well, I think, yeah, we did look very closely at that suggestion and spent a lot of time thinking about it and thinking about how that could be done in a clear and objective manner. Of course, the difficulty is that it would be difficult to implement in 2 years' time. Going back, the developer might not still own the property that the trees are planted on. The tree point, if somebody's using the clear and objective path and they're obtaining tree points and they're using, those trees don't have to necessarily be planted within the habitat boundary, and they don't necessarily have to be in a it doesn't have to be in a set aside area. So they could be in yards, they could be in various places, which provides a lot of flexibility for protecting. What we're hoping is that it provides flexibility to protect existing established trees. It's meant to encourage that, but it doesn't necessarily make it easy to then have somebody have the right to go back and check in everybody's backyards. Oh, is that tree still there? And so for the developer to, in 2 years' time, try to get back their bond was where we were struggling with, like, the logistics of it. It gets very complicated. We're having a really hard time crafting clear and objective language that would accomplish that goal. So that's basically where we thought we would just take it back to what we originally proposed, which is to the clear and objective requirement is to plant the trees before certificate of occupancy. There's an option to bond if that doesn't work for the development proposal. And that's the way the wording is in the draft right now. So no changes were proposed, again, primarily because the logistics of doing so were complex and difficult to make clear and objective and fair.
Okay, so the bond is only if the replanting has not happened at the time of certificate of occupancy. The bond is only to get those trees into the ground, and then the bond is released once they're in the ground.
That is, and it's an option. So I think the preference is that the applicant installs the trees, right? That is the clear and objective path. Install the trees, but there are certain circumstances where that would not be feasible. So somebody is going to be coming back in and doing something to the site, and they don't want to have to damage the trees they've just planted. So let's say there's a timing reason that they would want to wait to plant the trees.
Can I interject for a sec?
Yeah.
I'm struggling to understand this. If I pull a development application and I've got to take trees down or whatever I've got to do, and I've got to replace them, I've got to mitigate for them. Every development application I've ever done has got a bond for all the trees, maintenance, and for pretty much everything that happens on that property other than specifically on a house. So I'm struggling to understand. I mean, I got to replace street trees all the time that are under bond. So I'm trying to understand that.
Right, because, and it's a really good point, street trees, you would have the ability to go see that they're there, to check on them. These are trees that are potentially not going to be in the public right of way or publicly visible to you. And so that our concern was that you as the developer would not have the ability to, you've sold the property, you could sell it with the contingency that you have to be able to come back and check on those trees, or with the responsibility that the property owner would have to do it. I mean, it's solvable. Again, it was one of those things in the time frame that we had as we were looking at this and thinking about it. And again, thinking about the kinds of requirements that apply to publicly visible, trees and parking lots, landscaping and commercial sites. All those things are much easier to monitor than the kind of trees that we're talking about. So therein lies our challenge. But of course, we are happy to take a closer look at that at the commission.
Sorry to interrupt. I think we're talking about two different things, and I just want to make sure before we spend too much time on it. From what I understand, the way it works generally is we're talking about development applications here in general, right? I mean, if we're talking about how this is going to get applied. And generally speaking, when a development application happens, we're going to subdivide that land and we're going to sell houses off to each individual property owner. And there's going to be a storm pond and some street trees, et cetera. Per the declaration and per the CC&Rs for the community, the declarant for that property has a blanket easement across that property to make sure that their bond gets refunded. They have to bond for maintenance. They have to bond for trees. They have to bond for performance. It may not be under this ordinance that bond's occurring, and that's okay, in part because I don't think we want a fourth bond pulled. They're already pulling 3 bonds for other stuff anyway, right? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to capture that in my mind. Am I missing that, you guys? I think that there are ways to capture that without having a specific bond for this work. Am I wrong?
So different jurisdictions may be different. The county, the only bonding right now that the county allows is it's bonding for improvements in the public right-of-way. So that would include making sure that the roads get built, making sure that the street trees get installed. I think there's a 1-year maintenance period for the street trees and sidewalks and that sort of thing. So that's the only thing right now that the county has bonding for. And so we've talked about how will we even do this for improvements on private property, and that's a new area for the county that we're going to get into with this program. But the maintenance and doing it over time, there may be a homeowner association that takes over, there may not. I know in road improvements, a lot of times we do require that the maintenance be done and there be a homeowner association established, but we hadn't gotten there with these requirements.
So I get what you're saying. You guys have got the public street improvements, and that would cover part of this, right? You're taking a small part of it, but it's part of it. And then I can tell you that, clean water services or in the particular case of stormwater areas and mitigation areas, clean water services throws a bond that has to be done on that as well. But what I'm trying to get to for Commissioner Rosenberry is I do think a lot of this, maybe not every tree, but a lot of it gets covered by a bond already. And I know I end up just in my job managing HOAs, after the period of the bond being up, I end up replacing a lot of those trees for maintenance issues. But during the bond, the developer actually does come back and replace them. So even if the county doesn't have it here, I think you are going to get most of it covered by most other institutions one way or another. I think that was the confusion. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. And just to clarify, we are talking about trees that are specifically not in clean water services jurisdiction. So these are the upland trees, not riparian trees. Right. So yeah, they would not be in that boundary.
Okay.
Can I, because I think
Commissioner Fry.
I think some of the confusion, thank you. Some of these trees are going to be, that we're going to be, assigning points to in theory, then they're going to be in somebody's yard. And if I know some jurisdictions have similar ordinances and whatnot, and the trees get inventoried and tagged and all that stuff. But I'm thinking as somebody who's then in charge, if you did put a bond on that, as a developer, builder, whoever, the person in charge of that bond, the homeowner can come and they shouldn't, but they could come and cut down that tree. And then all of a sudden, you're stuck with a bond on something that was on somebody's property that they've now impacted. And then you add the fact, that's where my mind went first, but then you add the fact that it could be in somebody's backyard, and yeah, you don't really have the right to enter. I mean, you could try and create the language for the access to that. But to go back into somebody's backyard or something like that and say, well, that oak tree that's in the corner of your yard, not in like a buffer area somewhere that's separate, that's maybe HOA managed and controlled. Now all of a sudden we're trying to say, well, there's a bond associated with that and we have to be able to access it. So I can see the difficulty, and I would be very afraid to have to be bonded for trees in people's yards like that. And we already get, street trees and things like that already get kind of gray, I guess, with that, but they're in the right of way at least. So that's where it makes sense to me that you would have a hard time bonding it.
Commissioner Rosenberry.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. I'm coming from the multifamily background as the general contractor. So the developer brought us in to do the construction, and there is a very high level of lack of care. The instructions I've received, as much as I've wanted to be a very good citizen and protect our environment, the instructions are get it in the ground, it doesn't matter, if and it doesn't take, we'll be gone a few years from now. So just to give that context of where I'm coming from and why this feels important to me.
Well, I have a couple questions. And they're pretty specific. To follow up on this question of if the trees don't take, or, so we've got 2 years written in the draft ordinance. How is that monitored? Or is it monitored, or how, at 2 years?
Well,
by the county, I mean.
At this point, we rely on the language in the development code that says it has to be, it has to thrive after 2 years, and it would be primarily an enforcement issue of that particular provision as it's written. So we would, if there were any complaints that the trees were dying or dead and need to be replanted, we would rely on this provision and a condition of approval to have that replanted,
Right,
the tree
so
replanted.
if a complaint were made, you would have this provision to act on. But again, it's a complaint would have to be made.
I think it, kind of when we're thinking this through, I know a lot of people, like Commissioner Rosenberry, wants to do the right thing, and I think we can, thinking about putting together materials for new homeowners that say you have a regulated tree. It's this type of native tree. You need to water it, or things like that. Kind of encourage ownership of the property owner to take responsibility for the tree, and perhaps that can work 80% of the time. If not, we have the enforcement mechanisms that other.
That's excellent. Just tell people up front
what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Well, Commissioner Rosenberry.
My question is, who would you follow up with? If the property has been sold, if it's multifamily or commercial, and there's a new owner already, who is responsible for that?
So these are trees on private property, so they're the responsibility of the property owner, whomever that is. So that's who you would follow up with. I think, these are new regulations. There's going to be a learning curve all around. We'll have to have some new ways of doing things in place. So website, ways to really help people understand the process and understand what the regulations are. It's imperfect, sure, but it's what we've evaluated so far with the kind of the hindrances that are in place for having a bond, trying to have a maintenance bond.
And I think there are different kinds of development that will happen under these rules. So if there is a land division, or if there is a large multifamily development or something like that, there may be a homeowner association or another company that's doing maintenance that would be responsible. But in other cases, there may not, and that's kind of what we're faced with.
I think like with the tree canopy requirements, where there's a set aside area, I think that's one way that could easily be monitored a lot better than on the private property. And with a multifamily development, that's what you might find is a set aside area of open space that's used for the tree canopy requirements.
Commissioner Kaiser. Chair,
I hate to be the one who douses some water on the positivity of the county here. Look, I maintain 20,000 homes and 131 different HOAs. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you think you're getting 80% of people to take care of those trees, you are wrong. It's not even close. Okay. In fact, from the HOA's perspective, when we're dealing with that, we're trying to enforce your rules in order to make that happen. And we can't get 80%, and we have the ability to fine and fee and do all sorts of stuff, right? So I appreciate you guys offering that answer. And I know that's what we collectively wish was true. But the truth of the matter is there isn't any enforcement for it, and there's no money to enforce it. So a lot of times all we're really talking about is hoping on faith that after 2 years, that tree is still going to be there. I wish it wasn't true, but that is what's true.
Commissioner, Vice Chair Moore, Bidu, do you have your?
Thanks, Chair. I was going to kind of direct this towards the staff report and the other items beyond the scope of the current ordinances. There is a section in here that talks about staff working with county council to develop enhanced enforcement requirements. And just wondering what staff's opinion is on that, and also if that would improve on the clear and objective standards.
So Erin is not here, but I can speak for her as the director's representative. We have talked about this, and it has been an issue at times, people removing trees in significant natural resource areas where they weren't supposed to. They didn't have a report saying there were hazardous trees or anything like that. And we're pretty limited right now on what we can do. And so I think there is interest at the department level to potentially beef up what we have in our county code. It's not in the development code, it's in the county code of ordinances, and it's a separate, not a land use ordinance thing. We don't have direction from the board to do that, but we would be happy to bring that forward as part of this ordinance discussion to say there has been concern about this issue. This is something that if directed, we could work with county council to look at increasing the right now the dollar amounts are relatively low. Those could potentially be increased. It could be per tree. We could actually say in there that tree removal within significant natural resources is an enforcement item. So that is something that I think we would be supportive of talking with the board about, but it's something that the board would have to give us direction to do.
Okay, thank you. I would appreciate it if that is something that you pursue. Thanks.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Just one last question.
Commissioner Will.
I think you guys have already said it, but just want to. It came up a lot in the testimony, especially from some of our nonprofit groups that are trying to help protect the natural areas in the county, where they said we missed an opportunity with the draft ordinance in front of us to beef up some other protections. I heard the staff report talk about how there was direction from the county commissioners to have a certain level of protection that's the current level of protection. So is the staff, for our clarity, that those comments by whether it's citizens who want more protection or take advantage of creating something more protective, that's the reason why it's not there, is because we weren't directed to, and this has to be voted on and passed by that same group of commissioners. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct, Commissioner Will. That seems to be a pretty accurate statement there.
Okay, yeah, so if we as planning commissioners want to enact stricter requirements or as a recommended engrossment, that may fall on deaf ears, or it may not get much traction with the planning commission. It's a risk, I guess.
Well,
I'm saying.
I would hesitate to speculate. They are relying on you to provide your recommendation to all of the information that's before you, and I think that they value your position. But our initial task at hand was to keep the same level of protection that we had for riparian, and to clarify the clear and objective standard for the wildlife habitat areas, and provide that mitigation.
I think that's always a challenge for me when we hear about different ordinance coming forward. One ordinance isn't always a silver bullet to solve every problem. I mean, sometimes people build tough sheds in their backyard that are illegal, and code enforcement has to go check on them, just like people cut down trees that they shouldn't, and code enforcement has to go get them. And the county may need stronger teeth to enforce rules against tough sheds built in the wrong spot, and maybe they need stronger teeth to help protect these trees that are getting planted. But maybe this ordinance isn't the solve all. So it sounds like some of these things maybe could be addressed in another ordinance, or is it always, or even policy is what you're saying? Sometimes not always ordinance, it's just procedures that you guys could look into?
Sure. I think the information that the board has, then they will direct us how they find appropriate.
Okay.
We take our direction from the
Commissioner
Okay,
Fry?
thank you.
I have a number of comments as we work through the slides. Some of them will probably be fast. Is it possible to pull up slide 18? This is on the topic of, if I've got my slide notes right, this would be on the topic of kind of reasonable areas and distances for trees, 5,000 square foot.
The disturbance area?
5,000 square foot polygon, and the 10-foot distance to the house.
I have slide 7. Oops, there it goes.
Maybe 16. Yeah, I was trying to catch.
Did you want 16?
Maybe that's where we're at. That looks right.
Okay.
It's on this topic at least. So we kind of covered some of this already with the clear and objective. The clear and objective isn't necessarily that the rule itself has to be clear and objective. It's that the ability to enforce that rule, there has to be a clear and objective way to do so. It's not, because we're saying, are these policies themselves clear and objective? I think we've asked questions that maybe they're commented, maybe they're not. But then if you have the enforcement of those being clear and objective, that part is what the standard is. But I guess through, there's a comment, and I just got the wrong slide. So it says, there was I think the wording was reasonable areas that was shown on the slide. Yeah, yeah, right there. Thank you, 17. And I guess I was just kind of trying to understand. I know we talked about a 5,000 square foot lot is kind of a general size for lots in a lot of neighborhoods now, and that was kind of some of the rationale. But I also know that public testimony said 5,000 square feet doesn't get you anywhere if you have a 100-foot tall tree or something like that, or whatever all the different things are. it felt 5,000 square feet. If you actually stand on that and you look at trees around you on a 5,000 square foot lot, that could, in some opinions, feel like a very small area to have like clearing clearing abilities for. And similarly, the 10-foot rule, when you start talking about root disturbances to foundations and things like that, just how close 10 feet really is to a structure. That's very close. So I guess I wondered how those were arrived at, really, and to me it seems like there's question if that should be reconsidered.
Well, first of all, it's not a prohibition on that removal, right? It would be a determination of what type of permit would be required, but how we landed on the 5,000 square feet and the 10 feet, I think Kathy would be the best one to kind of answer where those areas came from, but you're correct about the general size of a lot.
Yeah. So, thank you, Michelle. So as far, I mean, again, these are choices that the county can make, and you could choose to recommend a larger area of disturbance. We were responding to, in the case of the 5,000 square foot disturbance area, we're responding to property owners that had an existing house, typically, and wanted to be able to add a garden or add an accessory dwelling unit or otherwise use a reasonable portion of their lot. Now, presumably, if they're taking out a lot more trees than that, if they're doing a bigger development, if they're redeveloping the site, for example, to add middle housing, and they want to really do something substantial, they have other options. This is just if they want to just do the 5,000, they can do a type 1, and it's quick and easy. It's clear and objective. They just do that process. If they want to do more, there's plenty of other options. They are not tied in to just the 5,000. Now, again, it was responding to some very specific kind of public comments that we heard in our open houses and so forth. And again, looking at what seemed to provide people with land for a garden and a pool and an accessory dwelling unit and, some area, 5,000. So we kind of looked at disturbance areas. It seemed reasonable. Again, that's an area if the commission wanted to say, we think it should be 6 or we think it should be 7. That's, certainly within your prerogative to make a different recommendation. To provide, again, more flexibility that is for existing residential dwellings. The 10-foot option is 10 foot from each building. So you can imagine, and that is for example, that's for institutional, for commercial, for any type of building, residential. If you choose that path, you get 10 feet from each building. Now, the multiplier effect, if you can picture it, if you were to say, take that to 20 feet, you're talking about say the house has a 1,600 square foot footprint. You're talking about a really substantial area that you're going to be clearing trees. Again, I think this is a question if you would like to provide more flexibility to property owners to remove trees within the habitat area. That's something I think that's available to you to recommend. But it is, we also have been hearing from the community that protecting trees is important, and that, the trees in these habitat areas in these upland habitat areas are important. And so we're trying to find a balance there. And so that's the backstory on that, if that's helpful.
Thank you. Yes, it is helpful. I think that there is a balance in the property owner's rights and their own use of their property that comes into question there, where if people want to preserve trees, they're doing so by requiring their neighbor to maintain trees on their property within these kind of tighter parameters. And again, 10 feet can have a lot of impact from a tree on a structure. And 5,000, we hear a lot, and we heard it here in some previous meetings about how small and how tightly we pack in houses and development and things like that. 5,000 square feet is usually viewed as a very small area to people when you're speaking with them about a lot size. So those just felt a little overly restrictive to me, and that's something I suppose we can continue to discuss as a commission if we think that would be worth evaluating and changing. I'm not sure if we need to cover slides 19 through 21, if my numbers are right on my notes there, because they weren't on the last one. But it was, I had notes there where it was, there was talking about the impact of, when a property owner visits.
Oh, this one? Is that what you're reading?
I think it started on 19, but some of the comment was it will not impact the property unless the owner wishes to develop. Let's see. Okay, could you go to the next slide, please? And then the next one. Yeah, so it's kind of a series of these, I suppose. They'll change it to land use regulations that have the potential to impact the property value. And this is where it kind of the language got the strongest to me in the slide, at least, where it was, it doesn't mean it will actually impact property value. But I didn't feel like that was an entirely fair statement. That this significant natural resource mapping is, if somebody has it on their property, it is absolutely going to impact their property value. It's not going to be, the development potential is going to be limited. And if it's a property that had any development potential to start with, it could be gone completely. There's a very real impact to the property owners there. And it is going to, for some people, it's going to potentially change retirements and change inheritance and change all kinds of financial situations for people. So I just felt like I wanted to acknowledge that significant natural resource mapping will impact property value. And that's not a judgment on whether it's right or wrong to map it, but it is going to impact the property values. Let me see, I can try and, I don't know if anybody else has any questions. I have a couple more slides that I wanted to comment on, but I can also pause if other people want to jump in.
Well, I wanted to, I see that, and also Commissioner Kaiser has his hand up too. Since we're getting close to 9 o'clock, I just wanted to kind of check in with commissioners and see how we're feeling for time. It seems to me like we may have time for questions tonight, but maybe not deliberation on whether we want to actually recommend this ordinance to the Board of Commissioners. So I wonder if we could suggest or just agree on how we want to move tonight. Are we going to just do questions and then maybe adjourn for that additional meeting for deliberations?
My preference, Chair.
I didn't hear who talked.
Commissioner Kaiser, that would be my preference.
Okay. How do other people feel? All right, so we'll try to do our questions, as many as we can think of, but save deliberation for next time. Do you have a comment?
My only comment would be that it would be helpful for staff to know if there are specific questions that you would like more information on that you'd like us to bring back for next meeting, that would help you in your deliberations. We would typically prepare a staff report. We have a week to do that, so it would help us to know if there are those specifics that then we could bring that for in the staff report. Or if you just would like more time to deliberate, that's fine too, and we wouldn't need to have anything in a staff report.
Yeah, and it's not just a time issue tonight, but also so much has been brought up that I think we probably want to think it over. A deadline for when to submit questions. I don't know, does staff prefer that, or?
Well, if you were able to give us specific thoughts in the next couple days, probably, so by the end of the week, we could include it in a staff report. If not, we could still have it, so if it takes a little bit longer, we would still have it. It might not be able to get into a written staff report, but we would be able to answer that for the next meeting.
And if I might also add, before I forget, if you continue your discussions, your questions and answers here, and then when you head home, in addition to the questions you might have, think about the proposed engrossments that you might want to make, because those will all have to be presented as a series of motions. So I move to recommend the commissioners engross it to do blank, and then we'll discuss it and vote on each of those before you get to voting on whether or not to recommend the ordinance with all the proposed engrossments. So I only mention that because I have a feeling there's going to be quite a number of proposed engrossments. That's just my detective work from your questions.
All right, then. Commissioner Kaiser.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate that. I wanted to come back to something that Commissioner Rosenberry said that I think is really important, and I did not want to forget it. You were talking about having a tree in an area next to a barn with say a horse and a tree falling on it. I think what I saw in here was a recommendation, or not a recommendation, but comments from Wilsonville stating, hey, it should probably be a dwelling. And then I think I also saw in the slides that there was, at least from county, like, hey, if we were going to do this, that's what we would do. Do you guys know which slide that's on?
Yeah, I think. Oh, it's 18? I was going the wrong way.
So there's the staff suggests. Okay, gotcha. When you say, first of all, when you say staff, does that mean you guys suggest, or do you mean City of Wilsonville suggest?
County staff.
Okay, good. Okay. So to this end, Commissioner Roseberry, what I heard you saying, if we went with the way the staff's saying here, then we wouldn't have that opportunity to do what you were talking about. So I just wanted to get some clarity from staff on that for everybody.
Well, it would depend on if the barn had all of those services of water, sewer, and power. But if the tree was already fallen on the barn, then that would be a hazardous tree or a diseased tree or a dying tree, and you would be able to remove it. Is that what you said, or did I miss something there? Or a healthy tree?
My question actually had been, we've become aware of trees falling on dwelling spaces and how that can affect safety. If there is a tree, if I live on a property that has very large trees and I know that my horses are in danger, but it's 5,000 square feet. That's nothing. That's the house, the garden, the barn. There's no way that fits in 5,000. How do I protect the animals? And I asked that question, and you said it was allowed to be removed, but now I'm starting to understand that's not a habitable building, and this doesn't get covered. And so I do want to get clarity on how we protect the lives of horses, goats, livestock on the property.
So I might say one quick thing, that we're looking at properties within the urban growth boundary. And so most properties are not going to be large enough to do that. But we probably do have some, and probably in the future development areas, there might be some barns. But I think for the urban area, that's probably not a typical situation.
I'm really thinking the yellow and orange components, and anywhere that's a recently adapted urban growth boundary zone.
Commissioner Will.
Thank you, Chair Lockwood. Related question, and I think it goes back to slide 16 as well. If you have a property that's, say, 40,000 square feet, in the urban area, and half of it is in upland habitat. So the front half is not, because you guys have a polygon. You don't automatically include the entire lot in the polygon, do you? You just really, it's the area forested in the back, and the front area is. So when we talk about that 5,000 square feet, if my house is in the front, right, and my house and my yard and my pool and my driveway and everything's not in the polygon that's the habitat area. So I actually have a 5,000 square foot polygon I can just cut into my rear yard, or it doesn't apply because that's not where my house is.
So,
Kathy's gonna
yeah, if we could ask
Yeah.
Kathy, because this was we just had an email about this today. That's what I was
We
thinking.
did.
Yeah.
That's such a good question, because I was realizing that probably should be clarified in one spot in the code. We were just talking about that today. So when you draw the polygon, you draw it around your so it's meant to be a site with an existing house. So you would draw it around your house, your buildings, your pervious areas. If it extends into the upland habitat, if your house is already in the upland habitat, if your barn is already in the upland habitat, your other improvements, so be it. If it's smaller than 5,000 square feet and you want to extend it, you want to put your new accessory dwelling unit in the upland habitat area, you can extend that 5,000 square feet into the upland habitat area. Right. But you don't get to get 5,000 square feet of additional disturbance in the upland habitat area on top of the house and barn and everything that you have already. At least that's the way it's intended to work. So it's meant to say everybody gets. It's not if your site were entirely in upland habitat, you get 5,000 square feet. If your site's not entirely in upland habitat, you get 5,000. You can at least have 5,000, and of course you're welcome to develop the part of your site to the extent that you would like that isn't. There's no limitation on that other than general development standards, right? So that is the intent, right? It's not meant to, and again, this is for somebody that wants to take advantage of this type 1 process, right? It's meant to be we had added it specifically to create an easy path for somebody that just wants to use their lot. There are solutions, for example, if you wanted to build a new barn or build a new riding arena or remove trees around your existing barn, and it was not in the 5,000 square feet, by all means, yes, there are paths forward to do that. The clear and objective path, you can it's not, you don't have to protect 50% of that area. It's 50% of the tree points. So you can remove trees as long as you leave 50% of the tree points, you're fine. So you can take out a lot of trees in that area. You can take out trees all around your barn as long as you leave 50% of the tree points. You don't have to mitigate, you don't have to plant new trees, you just have to leave 50% of the tree points. So there's a lot of room there to still use your land under you would go through a type 2 process to do that, but it would allow you to have a lot of flexibility. And if you wanted to remove more trees and you couldn't retain 50% of the tree points, because, for example, you were building a large covered arena and it was going to be taking up most of your site, then, you would be looking at coming up with planting or retaining new trees elsewhere on the site would be your option. So outside of the upland habitat area, and you would be earning points by either planting trees or preserving other trees.
Okay, I have a couple more questions. If I had the same exact property, what did I say, 40,000 square feet lot that was vacant, had no dwelling on it, would I still have a 5,000 square foot bubble I could create for my baby pool that I wanted to put in the middle of it?
No, it's only for existing buildings.
Dwellings, yeah.
Existing at the date of the adoption of the ordinance.
The last thing, if you could go to slide 16, you mentioned on another slide about the mapping updates and how you found properties that were less than a half acre. that had upland habitat on them, and those were removed. So technically, if we wanted to revise this slide for the next show, shouldn't we show a property that's more than 15,000 square feet? Because this property would have been removed.
Right.
Right. So we're really talking, when we talk about which types of properties would even have the overlay on them, they're going to be properties of, 22,000 approximately square feet.
23,000.
Yeah, yeah. Half of whatever an acre is, right?
Is that accurate, though, when they're contiguous to other parcels?
Yeah.
Yes, it's just single parcels, a half acre or.
Yeah. So all around you are 7-acre lots, and you coincidentally own a quarter-acre lot in the middle of it. They're all zoned, but you're not.
They would be subject to if they had a habitat patch, and even if there were trees all over your property, if you were under a half an acre, generally we would have removed.
Yeah. So this person right here can cut all of those trees down.
They can.
I just want to make that clear. The other question I have for you is about what they call lot coverage. So, like, I know if you have a 5,000 square foot lot and the zoning code says you're allowed 50% lot coverage, then that's half of 5,000. So you could cover your lot with buildings and stuff up to 2,500. If you have a 40,000 square foot, almost an acre property, and it's zoned, R10 or whatever, and the lot coverage is 50% lot coverage. So technically I could build a giant building covering 20,000 square feet of my 40,000 square foot lot.
I'm not sure if we have lot coverage requirements. I'm pretty
Large
sure
lots?
we don't.
No, so the county doesn't have lot coverage requirements in our code.
Okay, so that the reason why I asked that just simply is
Or FAR
understand
or
that
any of that.
relationship of the 5,000 square feet maximum, because it'd be kind of funny if I have a 40,000 square foot lot and I'm allowed to build a house that's 20,000 square foot with my garages and sheds, but I can only get a 5,000 square foot around it. So,
Right.
but that doesn't apply. So I thank you for clarifying.
I'm sure that there's some pretty big homes out there that reach that 5,000 square foot threshold.
Just by
Very
themselves, without their
quickly,
their
yes.
their
With their
trailer
garage
barn and stuff. So, but those larger lots, what we're basically saying is this is not intended for them. This 5,000 is intended for somebody who owns a 40,000 square foot lot in a little house and wants to add a shed and not have to go through a type 3 approval. So that's good. Okay, thanks for clarifying.
So we have Commissioner Fry and Commissioner Kaiser. I'm not sure who is next. I think maybe.
Go ahead, Commissioner Fry.
Thanks. I just want a little more clarification on this because it's not tracking right for me. So we could have a 0.49 acre parcel. It's under half an acre. We could have that in the middle of what we consider like a corridor of upland habitat. And the properties all around it at 0.5 acres would be, or 0.51, I don't remember if it was over or under, but they would be then mapped and restricted, but the 0.49 in the middle of it would not be.
Right, we had a baseline of a half an acre that we removed.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner
Just
Kaiser.
like Mr. Wellner was saying, 3 acres. So there might be, I saw, we're kind of running those preliminary, you have 3.001, and they would be subject to the regulations. So that was the threshold.
Commissioner Kaiser.
I've got 2 more questions, and then I'm going to shut up and let this meeting end. And these maybe are best answered by Kathy, but maybe staff. You just tell me. But going through this process when we're trying to put this ordinance together, how did we come up with or arrive at the percentage of tree retention for pre-2005, post-2006, and today? I know we've covered this before. I just couldn't remember how we arrived at it. If you don't mind reminding me.
Go ahead, Kathy. Okay.
Again, we were going through the ESCE process. We were thinking about the conclusions, thinking about lightly limit, thinking about what it means to be more protective in areas where we have Title 13 requirements to protect uplands. So those are our new UGB areas. Trying to provide flexibility. So what's at play is the percentage, be it 50% or 80% of the tree points being retained. So that was the way that we came up with a clear and objective choice for how to measure like that. And it had to set, I mean, again, with clear and objective standards, we need to make them a fixed number. So you have these fixed numbers. What ends up, the percentage matters, but how the tree points are calculated and how the preservation points are calculated makes at least as much difference as the percentage that you retain, right? So it's an interesting balance, again, of, okay, well, it's this many points. The points are earned in this way, right? So are there bonus points? How are points earned? And then how are points replaced? And so the idea, for example, of providing points for trees that are smaller understory trees, those count as replacement points. Preserving other trees that are not inside the significant habitat area count as preservation points. So when you're thinking about that balance, and again, we spent a lot of time thinking about it, talking to the TAC about it, thinking about running numbers, looking at sites, considering what lightly limit means, because it was like, well, we want to continue to recognize that this is urban land for urban development, but still try to accomplish the goals of Goal 5 as it's expressed in the lightly limit. So again, it's all those numbers are things for you to consider as you're balancing those numbers. Yeah. So it's not just the percentage, but it's how they're calculated on either side.
I think that was part of my question. Thank you for answering it. I think the other part was, I forget why the distinction was between 2005 and 2006. Was it metro related? Is that right?
It is, yeah. Okay. So the areas, the new UGB areas, and I mean, again, new is post December 28th, 2005, which is why we keep saying 2005, 2006, because it was right at the end of 2005 that it went into effect. And so lands that were added after that, Metro reached a different ESCE conclusion for their upland A and B in those new lands. That was part of their process. So they said, oh, those upland areas you need to protect. And so we were recognizing that, looking at what substantial compliance with Title 13 would mean. And that's why they have a stricter standard.
That makes sense. Thank you so much. My last question, kind of look at this in we've talked a lot about the micro side of this, 5,000 square feet, et cetera. Wanted to talk for a minute about a macro question that county staff maybe can answer. I was reading through both the ordinance and kind of how it would change the language. And I read in there the statement that staff believes that the greater the tree points, the greater the incentive to preserve the tree. I'm trying to understand how you arrived at that logic there, because to me, just working in housing and development, I can't think of a time where we've ever decided whether or not we were going to preserve a tree based on anything other than its economic value, and then also based on whether or not we just couldn't remove it. Right? I mean, that was the question, right? How much economic value does it have? And then also, where is it? Is it going to be in a spot that is just unworkable, right? So I'm trying to understand where you arrived at that conclusion.
Should I go ahead and answer that one? Yeah, okay. So the idea is that, let's say you have a really large oak on your property, and that tree is worth 48 points. You could protect that one tree and you could take out 50% of the tree points. So you could remove a bunch of other trees if you keep that one really big tree, right? So it's worth a lot. It's 50% of the points. It's not 50% of the trees. So that tree embodies a lot of points. So it gives you a lot more flexibility to, if you keep those large trees, if you keep those important species, you gain a lot of points to give you a lot more flexibility on the other side. Does that help?
That helps a lot. Thank you. That helps me, because really, if you go the other way, it gives you less flexibility. I think what you're saying is, hey, you can keep that oak tree and wipe out a bunch of other stuff. Congratulations. Or you can make the choice to get rid of the oak tree, and it's gonna cost you more in mitigation, which totally get. That makes sense. Thank you guys very much.
It kind of reframes when you're talking about economic value. It kind of reframes that value of that tree at that time for the placement.
One last question from Vice Chair Morbido.
Thank you. So with the clear and objective standards, there's a lot of, numbers that go into determining what is eligible and ineligible, and completely understand that. But my question is, was that something that the TAC drilled down on and discussed those specific numbers? Or was that determined in other ways?
I think a little bit of both. We had a couple of TAC meetings where we did look at the actual code language and go through the base numbers. What we heard were kind of those same, where we wanted to give bonus points from the TAC members, like close to riparian areas were important. Certain types of native species, habitat, trees were important. And I think taking that information, talking internally of what that balance really means, that kind of baseline information, not like, oh, do you like 8 points here? That's something that we kind of worked on internally.
Thanks. I just want to say thanks for all of your work. I know you worked incredibly hard on this, and all of the time you spent on it, and also the TAC members, because it takes a lot of time and effort and energy as well.
Thank you. We had a really great group of people on the TAC, as well as a lot of staff, and we had a great consultant team that worked very tirelessly on this, and we really had a lot of public input. I think that helped inform the direction to go in, and looking at a lot of different opinions. So it was definitely a community effort, I feel.
Commissioner Fry.
Two more, please. Slide 22. So I think the concern, there were the comments about, the parcel sizes, and some of this was, first thing was talking about preliminary development approval, and that's where I kind of wanted to focus. Is that I know in the county, in the comments from staff, it said basically, and I understand that applications can lapse, time can go by and people might not fulfill or complete the development. So that makes sense to me. But I've heard concerns of, should there be language directly addressing the fact that, because it's understood that these developments have been approved prior to and are not subject to the regulations. Is it possible to add language just acknowledging that these developments approved prior to are not subject to these requirements, just actually in the language itself in there? I think that would alleviate some of the concerns I've heard from people.
Well, I think that when we have a land use approval, we have a set period of time that applicants have to complete the process, and all of the standards have that same ability to go with what the code is as the approval is and within that time period. So it's not just on the particular standards in the proposed 422. And our staff is well aware, processing these applications, what those timeframes are, and would be able to respond to any questions from the public if they thought that there was a violation in the regulations. So we can point them to many different provisions that are available that says they have the right to go forth with the standards that were in place at the time of the land use approval. So we kind of hesitate to add additional language in one particular section when it really is affecting the entire code and that development approval.
I think the concern is not that the staff wouldn't be able to respond, it's that it's almost more perception and some of the conflict that can take place in a community as a result of confusion that comes up. That was conveyed to me by some people who are concerned about it. My next question is on the oak value. So we talk a lot about oaks, and I do understand and hear a lot of the reasoning behind valuing oak trees. I also know that oak trees are they're messy and they break, and I have them behind my house and they're beautiful, but there are a bunch that have fallen over, and I have a friend who's thankfully his daughter walked out of a room before an oak went through their house because she was 2 minutes away from being dead because it wiped out their half their house. So there are questions about oak trees that I think have been in part raised. There's also a recent study, and I'm not an expert on trees by any means, but there's a study recently at Michigan State University, and it raises an interesting question regarding oaks and isoprene, and apparently increasing particulate matter as a result of having oak trees. And this study is not suggesting we clear cut all of our oaks, but they're saying perhaps we should be thinking about other kinds of trees as well. So I guess as we've put all this emphasis on oaks, I'm kind of curious if they maybe warrant all of the points they get, if there are these other concerns being raised about them. And I'd be very open to hearing comments on that. But it's just kind of stood out to me as oaks being so beloved and valued when they have drawbacks.
I'm not familiar with that study, and we can definitely take a look at that issue. I think we limit it to the 3 different species that we've heard in the community that are native and are of important to the community. And this is kind of a community-based exercise, and so they're given a limited number of bonus points. But we're happy to take in additional information about it.
Yeah, I think we can definitely research it. I know those 3 species that we included are important for their habitat value. So they support certain species that other trees and understory don't. And so I think there's a lot that goes into why those 3. But we haven't looked at other issues with them. So we could look at that a little bit more.
Seeing other hands up or buttons pushed. So with that, I think we will close our tonight's treatment of these ordinances. Thank you both very much. Oh, thank you. All right, thank you. I will invite a motion to continue this matter.
4th at 1:30 p.m. If that's the correct date and time that we have, that's what's on my calendar. I do that because Section 7A of our rules requires that.
Thank you. I'm grateful.
The first Wednesday
of the rules
of September.
Commissioner Rosenberry.
I move that we
continue
this conversation to
this matter. Sorry.
I move that we continue this matter to the meeting scheduled at September 4th at 1:30 p.m.
Thank you.
We have a motion and a second to continue this matter to September 4th at 1:30.
Could I request a clarification whether you intended to continue deliberations only or continue the hearing? And I don't know if that's an okay.
I just said matter because if you chose, you could theoretically reopen the public hearing. Somebody could make a motion to reopen the public hearing. So I just used the generic matter in my recommendation to you. But you've already closed the public hearing. What's left for you is any more questions you might have in deliberations and decision. But however you want to list it on the agenda, I'm fine with. But if somebody already wants to presuppose you want to reopen the hearing, then you could make that motion now.
Chair Lockwood, I'd like to second the motion.
Did we have a second already?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't hear it. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't hear it. Thanks.
So right now what you have is a motion to continue this matter to September 4th at 1:30 p.m.
Am I understanding correctly that at that time we could reopen the public hearing?
If you had another motion to reopen the
if there were
public
an
hearing.
additional-
Otherwise, you would continue on with questions, deliberation, and decision.
Thank you. All right. It's been moved and seconded to continue this matter till September 4th at 1:30 p.m. Can we just have a voice vote here?
That would be fine.
All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Okay, the motion carries. And we'll continue this to September 4th at 1:30. I think that concludes the ordinances tonight. Next item. We're not quite ready to close. Planning Commission announcements is the next item on the agenda. Does anyone have an announcement tonight? Commissioner Will.
I don't know if you call it an announcement, but I guess I got announced that at my job, there's always somebody who writes an email when it's somebody's birthday, and I just thought it was very nice tonight to hear all the great participation from all the planning commissioners. And I don't know how long you've all been serving, but I think it's something I just want to say thank you for your participation tonight to everybody, and thank you for your years or months or weeks of service. As the case may be, I think it's important to recognize that we've all been here, not just a few hours tonight, but a few months and a few years in some of our cases. And I just want to say, announce my happiness, to be working with such a great group of people that are working so hard for the community. So good job tonight.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate that comment. And I second those sentiments. I have an announcement, just that I will be away at the next meeting, so presiding will be in the capable hands of Vice Chair Moribidu. And since I won't be here, I'm not going to comment on specific provisions in the ordinances, but I just wanted to say that I do appreciate staff adding a couple of things as possibilities that could be engrossments or suggestions to the board. One about enhanced enforcement, possibly the staff working on that after this ordinance, assuming these ordinances are passed. And then also developing a heritage tree program. I would be in favor of that. And I'm also in favor of mitigation when public utilities remove trees. So I agree with the testimony we received tonight. I think that's in the best public interest to require mitigation. But with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded. Any objection? Seeing none, we are adjourned. Thank you very much, everybody.